Welcome back to another explainer. Look, if you're an automation developer, you already know the absolute headache of moving Captcha workflows into Cloudflare Queues for production, right? I mean, during your first local test, it looks beautifully simple. A task enters the queue, a worker grabs it, the solve request goes out, and boom, a token comes back. Easy. But as we're going to see today, what works perfectly while you're babysitting it on localhost can just completely fall apart the second it runs unattended. You know the story. The token comes back, the workflow continues. It's a deceptively simple narrative, but well, production is a whole different beast. Once that exact same workflow gets deployed and runs through Cloudflare Workers, background queues, scheduled jobs, internal tools, basically any unattended automation, all those little weak points start to show up. You might get a token solved perfectly by your API, sure, but then the destination site just outright rejects it.
There's just this massive, stark contrast between your local test and production reality. Your local test, that's the happy path. It's usually just one single CAPTCHA, and you're sitting there manually watching it succeed. But production means workers, unattended automation, retry storms, and strict queue limits. A queue all by itself doesn't magically make a workflow reliable. Taking the heavy lifting off the main request path is definitely a good start, but when you're dealing with serious scale and real-world latency, you need a completely different architecture.
So to get us from those fragile scripts to battle-tested automation, we're going to walk through a strict operational checklist. We'll cover the production reality check, scoping and validating inputs, preserving the session context, pulling limits and retries, and finally, measuring true workflow success.
Okay, let's dive right into step 1, the production reality check, which is all about authorization and boundaries. Literally, before you write a single line of code, you need to ask yourself, is this your own application or is it a client-authorized workflow? Because these integrations belong strictly in owned, client-authorized, or contractually permitted environments. Are you running an approved data collection agreement? Honestly, if your use case is even a little bit unclear, stop right there. That is definitely not a stable foundation for automation. All right, once authorization is crystal clear, you've got to define exactly what your queue worker actually owns. Please do not let every single CAPTCHA action become one massive vague queue message. Does your worker only submit the solve request? Does it pull for the result? Does it store the token? Or does it actually confirm downstream acceptance? Having really clear task boundaries makes debugging infinitely easier when things inevitably go wrong. Moving on to part 2, scoping and validating inputs. Basically, preventing bad data from ruining your day.
This is the absolute starting line of your workflow. And frankly, bad request data is the root cause of almost all queue failures. So before a message ever enters your queue, you've got to verify the required value straight from the live page or the network request. You need the exact site key, the precise page URL, the action value, do not guess, and absolutely do not reuse stale values. Send only what that specific CAPTCHA type needs, like proxy details or session fields. And queuing extra data just because you have it, that just creates massive, confusing, false debugging trails later on.
Now for section 3, preserving the session context. This right here is arguably the biggest point of failure in the entire process. This explains why you might get a perfectly valid token back from the solver, but it still gets immediately rejected by the site. We need to talk about session context. That is the exact browser context, the cookie jar, the HTTP client, user agent, or the IP state that triggered the original challenge. See, a CAPTCHA token doesn't just exist in a vacuum. Because queue-based workflows completely separate the background work from the original request, they are incredibly vulnerable to session mismatches. So you have to really ask yourself, does your queue message actually preserve the correct session reference? If a solve token is rejected, your very first instinct should be to check for a session mismatch. Are you applying that newly solved token back into the exact same browser context or HTTP session that triggered it in the first place? Are the same cookies still present? Think about it. If you apply a token in a completely different session, the downstream verification is almost always going to fail, no matter how perfect that token is. That brings us to section 4, polling limits and retries. This is how we actually control the queue. A lot of solvers use a submit and poll flow, right? But you simply cannot let a worker poll forever. Here are the strict rules you need to follow. Step 1, submit the task. Step 2, wait exactly 15 seconds before your very first poll. Step 3, poll every 5 seconds after that. And step 4, enforce a hard cap at 120 seconds maximum.
Overpolling just adds unnecessary noise, while underpolling slows the whole workflow down. This 15-5-120 structure, that's the sweet spot. Because a worker stuck in an endless polling loop is just chewing up your resources without actually producing a result.
Okay, but what about retries? Well, queues make retrying tasks incredibly easy, which actually makes them incredibly dangerous. The magic number here is 3. That is your absolute maximum retry budget cap, and you definitely should be using exponential backoff. If you let every single failure retry automatically forever, oh man, you're going to create a massive retry storm, burn right through your API balance, and completely hide your bad configurations. Infinite retries are a terrible idea, and here's exactly why. Think about common errors. If you get a wrong user key error, retrying isn't going to fix it, right? You need to actually go recopy the key from your dashboard. If you hit a zero balance error, a retry is just wasting compute. You need to top up your account and set up an alert. If a CAPTCHA is flagged unsolvable, okay, retry exactly once. But if it persists, open a support ticket. Retries are meant to recover from temporary little hiccups, not to mask a fundamentally broken setup. Finally, Section 5, measuring true workflow success, going way beyond just getting the token. Because queue workflows often fail completely silently in the background when nobody is watching, we really have to clearly define what actual success looks like. There's an absolutely critical distinction to make here. CAPTCHA solver success simply asks, hey, did the API return a token? But downstream workflow acceptance asks the real question, did the protected workflow actually complete? A successful CAPTCHA solve absolutely does not guarantee the full workflow succeeded. If your solver success is high but your actual workflow success is low, you need to go investigate your session context, your token placement, or maybe an expired state.
To measure this effectively, you need some very clear targets. For first-off latency on token CAPTCHAs, your target at the P50 mark, so meaning 50% of your requests, should be under 25 seconds. If you're consistently hitting under 25 seconds, it tells you a few things. The integration is healthy, the queue is processing smoothly, and you aren't getting bogged down waiting around on unnecessary retries. And here is your ultimate operational goal. You want an end-to-end downstream acceptance rate of 95% or higher post-token. Notice I did not say a 95% solver rate. I mean that out of all the tokens you solve, 95% of them are successfully accepted by the downstream server in the exact same session context you applied them in. That right there is the absolute gold standard for a stable, unattended queue integration. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, kind of provocative thought. It is time to stop measuring tokens received. A token is literally just a key, and a key is totally useless if it doesn't actually turn the lock, right? The only real success metric that matters for your production environment is this: did the protected workflow complete? Keep that question right at the center of your queue architecture, stick to this checklist, and I promise you, your automation will finally be ready for production. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.